Moana. I was still completely and utterly shocked that Edric announced that we were in a relationship on live television. Even long after Selena shut off the TV and ordered the maids to return to their work, and even after I woke Ella up and got her ready for the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. In some ways, I was elated that Edric announced that I was his secret fiancé, since it meant that he may have been slowly coming around to the idea that we could be together. However, I still didn't know exactly what all of this meant. Would we only be in a fake relationship? If this really did only ever turn out to be a fake publicity stunt, I couldn't help but wonder if it would only cause more confusion and pain. Our relationship was already rocky enough as it currently stood. Even though Edric knew that I was a werewolf now, I could still tell that he had hang-ups about real marriage. Not only that, but I didn't even know if we were mates. If Mina never fully emerged, then becoming true mates wouldn't even be possible. That was why so many wolfless adults wound up being shunned by the majority of the werewolf world. Obviously, there were countless other reasons for it as well, but one of the major reasons was that wolfless adults couldn't create a mate bond. Therefore, werewolves who did have their wolves wouldn't want to waste their time trying to bond with someone who could never feel the same way. Aside from that, the thought of only ever being a fake wife made me uneasy. I wanted to be with someone who loved me and devoted themselves to me and our child, not someone who only pretended to be in love with me to keep the media from creating negative news articles about us. The whole thing felt somewhat fishy, and I couldn't decide by that point if I should have just been happy that this potentially meant that Edric wouldn't marry someone else and make our home life confusing for our baby and Ella, or if I should try to find out what his true intentions were. Either way, I was completely confused. Later that evening, after putting Ella to bed, Edric still wasn't home. I couldn't sleep after everything that happened that day, so I sat on the couch and looked at my phone to pass the time until Edric got home. However, I quickly realized that I made a mistake when I started looking at social media. My eyes widened as I began to read all of the posts made about Edric and I. Somehow, within mere hours of Edric announcing our fake relationship, there were already hundreds, if not thousands, of posts about us. And the more I read, the more I began to realize that the majority of those posts were distinctly not positive. In fact, the majority of those posts were extremely negative. I always knew that Edric had a sizable fan base of women who adored him. After all, he was an incredibly handsome alpha billionaire, and up until today, he was always known as being single and available to the public. It seemed that a lot of those women believed that they had a chance at becoming the alpha CEO's next wife, and my presence seemed to royally piss them off. Even though I knew that it was never a good idea to read comments on these sorts of things, and that I should have turned off my phone, I couldn't stop myself from scrolling a little. My heart sank as I began to read some of the nasty comments that were made about me. "I can't believe Edric Morgan is actually planning on marrying a human," one comment read. "And he really had kids with her. Gross." "It'll be okay," another comment replied. "She's clearly just a human plaything. Plenty of the werewolf elites like to dabble with humans when they're bored and waiting for their true mate to appear. When he finds his real mate, he'll throw her in the trash where she belongs." As I read even more nasty comments, many of them seemed to fall into this similar vein. It seemed that most people agreed that I was nothing more than a human plaything for Edric, as they didn't yet know that I wasn't even a human. Not that it made it any better, of course. My entire life, I had been raised thinking I was a human, so seeing people speak about humans like that made my blood boil. Eventually, I came to my senses and realized that it was best to shut off my phone for the night. I tossed my phone down on the couch and let out a deep sigh, shutting my eyes as I leaned my head back on the pillow. This was too much attention, too fast. I never asked for this. Even though Edric's announcement of our fake relationship made me excited in the moment, I realized now that it might not have been a good thing. In fact, I couldn't help but worry if the stress of it all would impact my baby. I wished that he had at least talked to me about it first before jumping to that decision, and now it was too late. the news was out. I couldn't help but feel incredibly sad after that. Would my baby only ever be viewed as an impediment to other women's chances to be with the alpha billionaire? Even more so, would my baby be in danger with so many women being furious about my relationship with Edric, regardless of whether it was real or fake? Suddenly, I wished that I had simply stepped away from all of this as soon as I found out that I was pregnant. Maybe I should have taken Michael's offer and used the money to move to another city. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the fact that I enjoyed being near Edric and Ella, and even Selena and the maids. In a way, this place had become my home, and these people had become my family. Even after just a couple of months of living here, I already couldn't imagine living somewhere else. But the stress of the public finding out about our relationship still made me rethink whether or not this was a safe situation, not only for myself, but also for my baby. I tried to read a little to pass the time after I shut my phone off, but I found myself unable to focus with my mind racing, so I finally gave in and closed my eyes as I laid on the couch. Finally, a little while later, I heard the elevator doors open. I quickly jerked my head up and peered over the back of the couch to see Edric stepping into the foyer. He didn't see me at first. During those moments, as I watched him take off his jacket and his shoes, I swore I saw a slight smile faintly flickering across his lips. I couldn't help but wonder if he was smiling about his announcement earlier. And even the thought of his announcement making him happy enough to smile made my heart flutter. Edric. I came home that night after a long, exhausting day of work. The news of my fake relationship with Moana quickly spread, and I found myself having to dodge all sorts of questions about it from intrigued coworkers. Thankfully, my father didn't appear yet to berate me for it, although I knew that it was only a matter of time until that happened. When I arrived at home, I just wanted to sleep. The apartment was quiet and dark, so I took off my shoes and my jacket before heading into the living room to have a drink before bed. However, when I walked into the doorway, I finally saw Moana peering at me over the back of the couch. I knew instantly from the look on her face that she had seen the news. And I also knew that I would have to explain things to her, as she was clearly upset. Admittedly, I knew that I shouldn't have said what I said earlier that morning. It just slipped out in the heat of the moment, and I found myself regretting it afterwards. But what was done, and now we had to make the best of it. "I'm sure you'd like to talk," I said, sticking my hands in my pockets as I watched Moana stand from the couch. "Let's talk in my office." Moana, who was dressed in her robe and nightgown, followed me to my study. I closed the door behind us in case anyone would overhear our conversation, then gestured for her to sit in one of the soft armchairs by the fireplace. But she continued to stand, her eyes burning with a combination of confusion and anger. "Let me explain," I began, but Moana quickly cut me off and shook her head vigorously. Her hands were balled up into fists at her sides, and as she shook her head, bits of curly red hair fell into her face. "Just tell me whether I'm just a human plaything or not," she said, her voice low and intentional. I furrowed my brow. "What?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" Moana let out an exasperated sigh and pulled her phone out of her robe pocket. I watched silently as she furiously tapped on her phone screen, then held the phone out for me to see. Of course, it was just as I suspected. It seemed that many of my fans were angry about this relationship, which I did expect. However, to make matters worse, they were saying horrible things about Moana and calling her a human plaything. They didn't know yet that Moana was a werewolf and that she was actually my fated mate. Of course, it wouldn't matter even if the public did know that Moana was a werewolf, though, because these women would have found any reason to be angry about it. I was used to this sort of thing, and that was why I had removed myself entirely from social media. But it was all extremely new to Moana. Seeing the look on her face and the way that her hand shook when she held the phone out to me made me feel even worse for jumping into this so soon. I should have spoken to her about it first and given her time to prepare. I didn't even ask if this was what she wanted, and I did feel bad about it. "Look," I said, watching as she shut off her phone and slipped it back into her pocket. "I'm sorry that I didn't consult you before I said what I said this morning. but now that you're in the public eye, there are some changes you'll need to make. To start, you'll be better off if you make all of your social media accounts private. Not only that, but you'll have to delete anything that's unnecessary or that could hurt our image. That includes any distasteful photos or posts. My manager can help you with that. Moana's eyes widened. She seemed taken aback. Why should I have to change my habits over something like this? She growled. You're the one who suddenly decided you were going to make this announcement. I had no idea. I sighed. If it makes you feel any better, I had no idea either, I replied. It just sort of slipped out this morning. I'll admit I got a bit overwhelmed with all of the paparazzi. Moana fell silent. I couldn't tell if she was understanding where I was coming from or if she was still royally pissed at me. Maybe both of those things at once. She stared at me with a certain amount of intensity for a few moments, chewing the inside of her cheek deliberately, before she spoke again. I still don't understand why you did this, she said quietly. I thought you didn't want to get married to anybody. Not only that, but you've made it abundantly clear in the past that you have no interest in having a relationship with me because of our differences in social status. And I'm positive that that hasn't changed at all, despite the fact that you know I'm a werewolf now. What changed? I didn't know how to respond. All I could do was stare at the floor unblinkingly as I digested her words. She was right. Even as a werewolf, there were still glaring differences in our social status, and a marriage was off the table. Aside from that, even though I knew now that she was my fated mate, it didn't necessarily mean that I was comfortable with creating a mate bond with her, or that I would want to commit to her. If I learned one thing about marriage from my parents' horrible history, it was that marriage was a complete sham and a waste of time. Even people who had a mate bond with each other, like my parents, still abused and cheated on each other. No matter how I felt about Moana, I couldn't picture myself committing to anyone like that. Sure, I was okay for now, just having a fake relationship with her, even if it meant never being with anyone else. I had been completely alone for years before I met Moana, so being without intimacy was not really a problem for me. I may have made it clear that I have no interest in marriage between the two of us, I said finally. But you also made it clear that you don't want me to get married to anyone, real or fake, because you clearly don't want Ella or our child to have another mother. So you had just as much of a hand in this as I did, and now I expect you to play the role as my fake fiancé. Isn't this what you wanted? Moana's eyes widened. I could see anger bubbling up inside of her, mixed with a bit of confusion. So it is only fake? She asked. I nodded. Moana was silent for a moment, staring up at me incredulously with her big green eyes, before she finally responded and took me completely by surprise by what she said next. Apparently, unlike myself, it was in fact an issue for her to live without intimacy. What if I fall in love with someone someday? She asked. What then? Moana's words made me freeze. All I could do was stare at her intensely, completely taken aback by this statement. Edric. What if I fall in love with someone someday? Moana asked, her green eyes full of fire and fury. What then? I froze at her words. My eyes widened as what she said settled in fully, and already I felt a little bit of anger and jealousy beginning to bubble up inside of me. Even though I partially understood what Moana meant, and that she didn't know yet that she was my mate, what she said just then angered me. The thought of her being with anyone else, despite the fact that I knew I would never be able to get married, made me feel almost sick. I didn't know how to respond for the longest time as a million different things whirled around inside my head. Finally, I was able to speak. You're free to make any decision you want, I replied, feeling my blood run cold as I spoke. But you had better be prepared to pay the price for a decision like that. Moana's face fell. She glared at me intensely for several long moments, almost as though she was in disbelief, before she spoke. Is that a threat? She asked, instinctively placing her hand over her belly and instantly making me feel guilty for my choice of words. Of course I wasn't threatening her. I only meant that she should be prepared to face the consequences if she chose to be with someone else. If she was going to have an issue with me being with someone else, even if it was only a fake relationship with another woman, then I felt as though I had every right to set my own boundaries as well. If she was going to fall in love with another man, then she could also leave my house to go and be with that other man. In fact, I was frankly appalled by her sudden double standards. I wanted to tell her all of these things that were on my mind, but I was suddenly reminded of what the man in the baby supply store had said about not fighting with the mother of my child. Moana had already dealt with enough stress this early on in her pregnancy, and I wasn't about to cause more stress by arguing with her. All I could do was sigh. "Listen," I said, passing my hand over my tired face. "What's done is done. For now, you need to just go along with it and pretend to be my fiancé. We can cross those bridges when or if we come to them. It's best for everyone right now if we just go through with this." Moana was silent. Her hand stayed planted on her belly, almost protectively, but I knew she was also soothing herself by holding her stomach. Then, without a word, she turned on her heel and stormed out. I watched after her while she walked away, and admittedly, she looked sexy in her robe. She had the sash tied around her waist tightly, accentuating her small waist and round hips. Maybe it was just because it had been so long since I'd been intimate with anyone, but even as she stormed out angrily, I couldn't help but be a little turned on. Maybe now that I knew that she was my fated mate, it would prove to be too much of a distraction. As soon as the door slammed shut behind her, I let out another sigh and sank into the armchair by the fireplace. Of course, I didn't like the idea that Moana could ever love someone else. She was supposed to be my fated mate. And after everything that had happened recently, I couldn't imagine not having her by my side. But at the same time, I knew that I would never get married, and I still wasn't even sure if I was willing or ready to commit myself to a mate bond. Would it be best if I just cut her loose so she could be in a normal relationship with someone? If her wolf never fully emerged, then she would never know that I was supposed to be her fated mate, and I couldn't help but wonder if it would be better for her like that. Not only that, but if she was already distracting me this much, I couldn't imagine the level of distraction that would come from it if we had a mate bond. How could I ever continue to perform well at my job as the CEO of WearCorp if I was constantly being distracted by this beautiful, red-haired woman? Maybe it really would have been best if I hadn't announced our fake relationship earlier that morning. But what was done, and we needed to stick with it for the time being if we didn't want even more unnecessary attention. If I announced my fake relationship with Moana, and then she moved out and we broke up a week later, it would only label me as someone who couldn't commit to anything. WearCorp stocks were already on the verge of suffering enough from this entire mess, and I didn't want to risk them dropping even more. But that wasn't the only thing on my mind. The stunt that Kelly pulled was still fresh, and I couldn't let her get away with it. I knew that she would only pay off the police if I tried to turn her in, or she would feign innocence too easily, and she would never receive any repercussions. However, I knew that her parents would not be proud of their daughter if they found out what she did. And so, even though it was late, I decided to call her father anyway. Just as I suspected, Kelly's father answered almost immediately. He was a businessman just like my father, and rarely slept. He was in his office until all hours most nights, poring over documents, and probably had no intention of going to bed anytime soon. "Hello," he answered in his usual gruff, gravelly voice. "Hello, Mr. Anderson," I replied. "It's Edric Morgan." "Ah, Edric. To what do I owe the pleasure at this late hour?" I stifled a sigh and chewed on my lower lip, unsure of how to broach the subject. I had always respected Kelly's father. Even though he was a ruthless businessman, he was a successful and proud person, and I always looked up to him in some ways. I hated to be the bearer of bad news, especially when it came to Kelly. She was his pride and joy, and aside from that, she had also given him plenty of trouble throughout her life. Hearing about yet another antic that she pulled might have just sent him over the edge. "Oh no," Mr. Anderson said. "You went silent. It's about Kelly, isn't it?" That was another thing about Kelly's father. He was terribly astute. "Yes," I replied. "What did she do this time?" I sighed and cleared my throat. Kelly paid rogues to attack my daughter and my fiancé. Kelly's father was silent for a long time, I could only picture his face turning bright red and his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone for dear life. She what? It's true, I replied solemnly. I wish I was joking, but I'm not. She nearly got my fiancé, and our baby, killed. I found Moana in the Rogue District the other day after Kelly was supposed to take her to a doctor's appointment. Kelly confessed to it herself. She thought she would play a prank on my fiancé, and it got out of hand. Mr. Anderson let out a long, drawn-out sigh. I see. I don't want to press charges right now, I replied, but I think that Kelly needs help. Serious help. Kelly's father made an indiscernible sound through the phone that seemed like a grunt. I could hear him pacing around the room through the phone. Very well, he said. Thank you for letting me know. I knew that Kelly would get in trouble like this someday, and I've been thinking about it for a while, but I think it's finally time. Time for what? I asked. Kelly's father sighed. Time for me to cut her off financially until she becomes a better person. Moana. I didn't sleep in Edric's room that night, and he never came to my room to sleep with me. I had to admit that I felt a little lonely without him, but I simply couldn't get over everything he had said to me. It felt as though I had no choice in the matter, and now I was stuck in a fake relationship that I didn't ask to be in and would have to change myself to fit the role of the billionaire's fiancé. Not only that, but what had he meant when he said that I should be prepared to pay the price for falling in love with someone else? There was no denying the fact that we were both young, and it would be nearly impossible for either of us to live our entire lives without feeling love for anyone else. Maybe it was natural for Edric to be closed off and without intimacy, but it wasn't natural for me. I craved a loving relationship with a good man, not just for my baby's sake, but for my own sake, too. What woman didn't want to feel loved and cared for? But then again, I did feel a little cruel for what I said. I suppose that it was a bit of a double standard for me to be angry with Edric to even consider a fake relationship with someone else while I considered falling in love with someone else someday. And maybe I shouldn't have said that. In the moment, it felt right, but it didn't feel so good when I thought about it while laying alone in my bed. The next morning, I woke up shortly before Edric left for work and ran into him on my way to the kitchen to make tea. Good morning, I choked out, feeling my heart race as we passed each other. Edric replied with hardly more than a grunt and brushed past me, leaving me standing in the middle of the dining room by myself. Of course, I expected there to be tension between us, but as I heard the elevator doors open and close without Edric so much as saying goodbye, I felt even worse about the situation. However, it was a beautiful day. Maybe I just needed to get out. I hadn't taken Ella out for crepes for breakfast recently, so I decided to get dressed and wake her up. Ella's big eyes widened when I woke her up with the mention of crepes. Really? She said, practically shouting as she jumped out of the bed. I nodded, stifling a laugh at the little girl's sudden energy after only waking up a few moments earlier. Yes, I replied. Get dressed and brush your teeth, and then we can go. Ella excitedly zoomed around her room as she got ready. I helped her put on a little dress and fix her hair, and once she was ready, we headed downstairs to the lobby. It really was a beautiful day outside, and I looked forward to even going on a little walk in the park across the street after we ate. However, I quickly realized that going out alone with Ella may not have been a good idea. At first, I didn't realize what was happening. There were a lot of people on the street, many of them with cameras. I wondered if there was something happening on the news. But when Ella and I exited the lobby hand in hand and the lights on the cameras began to blindingly flash in our faces, I knew what was happening. I was instantly stunned by the amount of flashing lights and all of the noise. Ella also immediately began to cry, not understanding at her young age what was happening. I held her tightly to my side as the paparazzi began to crowd around us, shouting their questions at us. Please stand back, I shouted, feeling my voice shake with fear. There's a child here and I'm pregnant. But the paparazzi didn't care. They only closed in on us more tightly, squishing us up against the building and blinding us with their lights as they asked their questions. How does it feel to be the Alpha CEO's new fad? One woman shouted. Are you and Edric Morgan really engaged, or is this just a publicity stunt in light of his poor treatment of human workers? Is Edric Morgan paying you to be his bride? Why do you think a wealthy alpha werewolf would be interested in a human such as yourself? Please, I begged again, ignoring the barrage of questions that were being thrown at me. Stand back. I felt tears begin to well up in my eyes. Ella sobbed into my skirt, clinging to me for dear life. I couldn't even see a way to get out over all of the flashing lights. Not that there was a way out anyway. They were fully closed in on us on all sides, with only the side of the building behind us. Suddenly, I heard a booming voice emanating over the paparazzi that caused a slight lull in all of the noise and the chaos. Back off! The voice bellowed. Now! I recognized that voice immediately. It was Edric. Daddy! Ella shouted, her face caked with tears. I let out a sigh of relief as I saw Edric forcing his way through the crowd. He didn't say anything as he came up to Ella and me, but he instead blocked us with his body. All of you leave now, he shouted. I had never heard him this angry before. His voice was deep and threatening, almost like a growl. Some of the paparazzi got scared of the alpha werewolf and scattered, but not all of them. One man in particular kept putting his camera in our faces, regardless of Edric's warnings, causing Ella to sob even harder. All of a sudden, Edric did something completely unexpected. When the man wouldn't stop taking photos and barraging us with questions, Edric's face turned red, and in one swift movement he pulled his fist back and then punched the man right in the center of his face. Nearby onlookers gasped as the man fell to the ground, blood gushing out of his nose and his camera shattering on the sidewalk. My eyes went wide, and Ella's wails raised in intensity, but Edric only whirled around and scooped her up with one arm while putting the other around me. He quickly ushered us both out of there and back into the lobby, where 2 security guards immediately locked the doors before more paparazzi tried to run inside. Edric was silent as we took the elevator up. Ella continued to sob and wail after being traumatized by the paparazzi, and it was all my fault. I should have known better. I half expected Edric to berate me for doing something so stupid when we got back to the penthouse, and I would have accepted it because I knew that what I did was wrong. But, much to my surprise, he didn't say anything. Instead, he only continued to hold Ella tightly in one arm while his other arm stayed firmly wrapped around me, and together the 3 of us collected our bearings in the foyer until Selena and the maids came scurrying in. "Are you okay?" Selena said, her eyes wide. "It's those goddamn paparazzi," Edric growled, setting Ella down now that she was a bit calmer. "They're animals. But it's over now at least. I'm glad I decided to come home for something, but I think I'll be staying now." But when my eyes shifted over to the TV and I saw that clips of Edric punching the paparazzi were already being broadcast on the news, I knew that I wasn't over. Now, because of a stupid decision I made without thinking about the consequences, Edric would have to deal with even more bad press. Moana. My eyes landed on the TV in the living room, which was already showing clips of Edric punching the paparazzi. I felt my blood run cold as I watched it. Not only did the paparazzi spread the clips of what happened so quickly, but I felt as though it was entirely my fault. If I hadn't made such a stupid decision to go out only a day after Edric announced our relationship, then none of this would have happened. Not only that, but I put Ella in danger by deciding to take her out with me, and now she was terrified. But when I looked over at Edric, he didn't look concerned in the slightest. Without a word, he calmly walked over to the television and shut it off. "Keep the news off for today," he said, turning to Selena and the maids. The 3 of them often liked to play the news on the TV in the background while they worked. But now it wasn't the best idea after what happened. Not only would it be upsetting for Ella to see clips of her father punching someone over and over again, but it would be upsetting for the rest of us as well. I opened my mouth to apologize to Edric, but before I could say anything, he pulled out his phone and retreated to his study. The door slammed shut behind him, and I could hear him speaking quickly. I couldn't help but wonder who he was calling, but the door was thick, and his voice was muffled. However, I could only imagine that he was calling the tabloid company like before to pay them off for the clips. I couldn't think of anything else that he would be doing, although I wasn't sure how successful it would be considering the fact that the clips of him punching the paparazzi were already plastered all over the news. Selena, the maids, and I all shot each other concerned looks. "This is all my fault," I whispered, feeling my eyes well up with tears. "I shouldn't have gone out there. Not with Ella, at least. I feel like an idiot." Selena shook her head and rubbed my back as she guided me over to a chair to sit down. Meanwhile, Ella was sitting on the couch and sniffling. Amy had given her a picture book to keep her busy, which seemed to be working. "It's not your fault, and you're not an idiot," Selena said gently. "You're not used to this, but let it be a lesson for the future. There's a reason why Edric brings bodyguards when he goes out without his mask on." I nodded and sat down. Selena brought me tea while I breathed deeply, trying not to stress any more about it for the baby's sake. Eventually, Edric came out of his study a little while later. "That's settled," he said, sounding rather satisfied with himself. I was surprised to see that he didn't even seem to be fuming. It almost seemed like this was nothing more than a mild inconvenience, despite the fact that he punched someone to save me. In fact, this was now the second time in the past week that Edric had saved me. First the rogues, and now the paparazzi. I couldn't help but feel a bit awed by his strength and ability to handle situations like this, but I still felt bad for what I did that morning. I quickly stood and looked at him, my brow furrowed with anxiety. "Edric, I'm so sorry." "I know you're going to apologize, and there's no need," he said nonchalantly as he poured a cup of tea for himself. "My PR agency handled it. With a few articles on how the paparazzi were harming a pregnant woman and a child, along with exposing a few other nasty things that those damn tabloids have done in the past, everyone will take our side. And maybe they'll leave us alone from now on." He paused then, sipping his tea, and glanced over at Ella. The stress of it all must have exhausted her, because she was now fast asleep on the couch. Edric then turned back to me and lowered his voice. "Maybe with everything going on, it wouldn't hurt to get out of town," he said. I raised my eyebrows, surprised by this proposition. "Oh," I asked. "Where?" Edric shrugged. "I like to keep the mountain estate for times like this. It's a nice, quiet place to go when the city gets to be too much. If you want to go, I'll take you and Ella." I was shocked, not only by Edric's calm demeanor about the situation, but also by the fact that he had just invited me on a small vacation away from the city. Even after I put his daughter and our baby in danger by going out during a media frenzy, he still seemed to have my best interests in mind. Or maybe he just had Ella's and the baby's best interests in mind. As I went about my day, I couldn't help myself from thinking about Edric's offer. Getting out of the city for a few days did sound nice, and I needed to de-stress. If I didn't manage my stress, I knew it wouldn't be good for the baby. But I wouldn't be able to do that if I was cooped up inside this penthouse for days until the media calmed down. Besides, I remembered visiting the mountain estate during my interview. It was stunning there. The mansion was surrounded by nature, the air smelled like pine trees, and the mansion itself was stunning. Maybe I could even bring my painting supplies and my easel so I could paint a bit while I was there. A nice little painting would be perfect for the baby's nursery. Finally, later that night, I decided to agree to Edric's proposition. I walked over to his bedroom in my robe and nightgown and knocked on the door. "Come in," he called. When I cracked open the door, the alpha billionaire was sitting up in bed and reading a book. He glanced up at me over the book, his eyes lingering on the lace of my nightgown for the briefest moment before his face turned slightly red and his eyes met mine again. "I decided that I would like to go to the mountain estate after all," I said, nervously fiddling with my fingers. "If you'd still like to go, of course." Edric set down his book and, much to my surprise, smiled slightly. "We'll go first thing in the morning," he said. "So soon?" I asked, raising my eyebrows. "What about work?" Edric merely shrugged. "My baby's health is my top priority," he said. "Besides, I'm the CEO. I have unlimited paid vacation days." For a moment after he spoke, he flashed a bit of a mischievous smile. It was only a second, but it made me blush to see him grin. The thought of Edric being willing to blow off work on a dime for our baby also made me feel happy, and that maybe things weren't so bad after all. "Thank you," I said. Edric nodded and picked his book back up. I turned to walk out the door again, but stopped when he called after me. "Will you sleep in here tonight?" Moana. I agreed to sleep with Edric that night. Even though I was still a bit upset by what he had said the night before, I couldn't deny the fact that I missed him and wanted his company, especially after the fact that he saved Ella and myself from the paparazzi. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of the shower water turning off. Edric was already awake, and before my eyes were even fully open, he came out of the bathroom in his robe with his toothbrush in his mouth. "Rise and shine," he said, his mouth full of toothpaste as he rifled through his dresser drawers. "We're leaving in an hour. You should go and pack." I sat up and furrowed my brow. It was still early. I knew that he had planned on leaving for the mountain estate today, but not this early. Nonetheless, I obliged and quickly rushed over to my bedroom to pack some clothes and toiletries for the upcoming few days. I packed my painting supplies and my small travel easel as well, just in case I did decide to do some painting after all. Within the hour, all of us were packed and ready to go. Selena helped Ella pack while I got ready, so there was no lag in our preparation time. Soon enough, all of us, including Selena and the maids, were piled into the car and on our way out of the city. "I love the mountain house," Ella exclaimed, swinging her legs happily as Edric drove. She had a little breakfast sandwich in her tiny hands from the bakery downstairs from the penthouse. Edric had purchased all of us something to eat there, as we didn't have time to eat breakfast and deal with cleaning up before we left. Once again, I was immensely grateful for the alpha billionaire's sudden kindness, and I was even more surprised that he still wasn't even remotely bothered by the paparazzi incident the day before. The ride to the mountain estate took a lot of winding and twisting roads that slowly led us up into the mountains. I could feel the air in the car begin to cool down the higher we got, which was refreshing. But at the same time, I felt myself become motion sick from all of the twists and the turns. When I had driven up to the mountain estate before, on the day of my interview, the road hadn't bothered me at all. In fact, I loved the drive, and the view was amazing. However, now that I was pregnant and prone to nausea, I felt sick the entire way despite Edric's careful driving. Finally, however, we reached the mountain estate before I threw up. I was relieved to finally get out of the car as quickly as possible and breathe in the sweet, chilly mountain air. While the maids took our bags in, I took my time to walk up to the front door of the mansion. It was a huge and sprawling Tudor-style mansion that overlooked the mountain range, surrounded by tall pine trees on all sides. The pebbled walkway was lined with fountains and statues that were covered in moss, and I paused to look at one of them. "I should have someone clean these off," Edric said suddenly, picking at a bit of the moss and looking at it between his fingers. My eyes widened and I turned toward him, shaking my head vigorously. "No," I said, "don't clean it off. The moss is beautiful." Edric raised an eyebrow. "Really?" he said. I nodded. "It makes everything look so lush and natural. Leave it alone, please?" Edric paused, then shrugged. "I guess you're right," he replied thoughtfully. "Maybe I will leave it alone." When we walked into the mansion, Selena and the maids ran around in a frenzy, opening up windows and curtains. Meanwhile, Ella ran about wildly, pounding her feet on the wooden floors. I called after her to slow down before she hurt herself, but it was too late. She was already long gone, exploring the mansion on her own. I couldn't wait to explore the mansion either. Later that evening, I was finally settled into my own room. It was a sweet little room with a bay window overlooking the garden in the back, which was lit by little lights that were dotted around on the stone fence. The sun was on its way down, casting the mountains in a bluish glow. I couldn't wait to get outside in the morning and paint the sunrise, but it had just begun to rain, and so I wouldn't be going outside tonight. Suddenly, I heard a knock on my door. I looked up to see the door open and Selena's head poke in. I waved for her to come in the rest of the way, and when she did, I saw that she was holding a long, wrapped gift box. "Mr. Morgan wanted me to give this to you," she said, setting the box down on the bed. I furrowed my brow and stood from the chair I was sitting in by the window. "What is it?" Selena merely shrugged. I tore open the wrapping paper, admittedly feeling a little excited, and my eyes widened when I saw what was inside. It was a beautiful blue dress, soft satin with thin straps, and it came down to my ankles. I held it up to myself in the mirror, my eyes still wide. What was this sudden gift for? I almost felt a little spoiled if he really got it for me for no reason. "What is it for?" I asked sheepishly. "Mr. Morgan wants you to have dinner tonight," she said. I swore I could see a hint of a smile on her lips. "And he wants you to wear that." Once again, I was taken aback by Edric's sudden kindness. Despite everything that happened with the paparazzi the day before, he continued to be nothing but kind and sweet to me. Not only that, but he was even kind and sweet even after I clearly hurt him the other night by mentioning that I might fall in love with someone else if we could only ever have a fake relationship. Was this Edric's way of making me feel better for everything, or was he secretly apologizing? I couldn't deny the fact either, that I secretly hoped deep down that this was his way of showing that maybe he would want a real relationship someday. And Mina seemed to feel the same way. She reacted strongly as I held the dress up to myself in the mirror. She had been reacting strongly to Edric's presence ever since he saved me from the rogues, but it was only getting more intense every day. I couldn't help but wonder if she was beginning to think that Edric might be my mate, but at the same time, I knew that she still wasn't strong enough yet to realize something like that. But I did know that she liked Edric a lot, and she wanted to get closer to him. And I wanted to get closer to him too. Moana. Selena helped me put on the dress. It fit like a glove and even showed off my growing belly a bit. As I stood in the mirror, while Selena fixed up my hair, I couldn't help but smile a bit while I looked at my belly in the dress. Even though I didn't particularly like the concept of not being in a real relationship and only being in a fake one, I was relieved to finally not have to hide my pregnancy. Now that everything was out in the open, I could finally enjoy the early stages of pregnancy when my belly was beginning to show the little life that was growing inside of me. Before, I had been nervous about what would happen when my belly was too big to hide anymore, but now I couldn't wait. The thought of walking down the street with Ella's hand in mine and my other hand on my big, pregnant belly, once the paparazzi calmed down and it was safer to go out, of course, made me smile. When Selena was finished with my hair, I headed downstairs to meet Edric. He was sitting at a small table by the window in the dining room when I arrived. The room was dark, aside from the light emanating from little candles that were scattered around, and he stood up as soon as he saw me. For a few moments, Edric just stood there and stared at me. Even in the darkness, I could see his eyes wandering my body, admiring the dress. It made me blush, but I didn't mind. Having him look at me like that made me happy. I felt like the lady of the house, even though I wasn't really. Finally, Edric tore his eyes away from my dress and cleared his throat. "Do you like the dress?" he asked. I nodded, feeling my hands tremble a bit with nerves as I approached the table. "It's perfect," I said sheepishly as he pulled the chair out for me so I could sit. "Thank you." "Good," he said as he sat across from me. "I was worried you wouldn't like it." There were 2 covered silver platters in front of us and crystal glasses filled with what looked like wine. I was a bit confused at first as to why Edric would give me wine knowing that I was pregnant, but he quickly explained when he saw the look on my face. "Sparkling grape juice for you," he said, "non-alcoholic, and wine for me." I nodded and blushed a bit. Of course, Edric wouldn't try to give me alcohol when I was pregnant, and I felt a bit silly for thinking that. He then lifted the covers off of our plates to reveal 2 decadent meals of what looked like lamb, fresh vegetables, and garnished with little sprigs of rosemary. My eyes widened at the beautiful meals, and finally I couldn't contain my curiosity any longer. "What's all of this for?" I asked. "This is so nice of you." "What, a man can't simply want to take care of the mother of his child?" Edric asked with a bit of a smile. My face went red. I was taken aback by his caring nature, but something told me that it wasn't just him simply wanting to take care of me. All of this felt too romantic for that. The candles, the dress, the beautiful meal. It was different from all of the other times that he doted on me. Edric's smile faded then as he looked at me. He seemed to be struggling to say something, but it finally came out. "I hope you won't want to leave," he said quietly. "Maybe. I don't want you to leave." My eyes widened at Edric's words. Was this true? Did he really want me to stay? But then, as I opened my mouth to respond, he suddenly changed the subject. We ate dinner together peacefully with light conversation after that. The rich, juicy flavor of the lamb combined with the taste of the vegetables, which almost tasted as though they had been pulled out of the ground on that very day, made me completely forget my nausea from before. And in fact, the longer we sat and ate together, the more comfortable I became. If I tried hard enough, I could almost convince myself that we really were husband and wife having a romantic dinner together. And even though it might not have been the healthiest thing to tell myself, I decided that it was okay to feel that way for just one night. After dinner, Edric stood and opened the set of French doors by the table, letting in the cool mountain air. "Let's sit on the porch," he said, taking his glass of wine and the wine bottle in one hand, then my glass and the bottle of sparkling juice in the other. I followed, still awed by our wonderful dinner together. Edric led me around the huge wraparound porch to a small sitting area. There were 2 chairs and a little side table there, which he set our drinks on and refilled our glasses. While he did that, I couldn't help but lean on the railing and let the light rain mist my face for a few moments. Everything outside the porch was pitch black by now, but I didn't mind. The darkness and the sound of nothing but the crickets was a welcome reprieve from the noise and the lights of the city, and I hoped that we could spend more time here in the future. No matter how much I loved the city, I still felt tired of all of the noise sometimes, but I had never really had a chance to get away from it all. There was only one time in college where I managed to scrape together enough money from babysitting and waitressing to take a little weekend trip out of town, but it wasn't nearly as nice as this. Now, I felt like I was living in the lap of luxury in this gorgeous Tudor mansion. When I finally turned back around, Edric was already sitting in one of the chairs with his glass of wine in his hand. I thought I caught him looking at me again, but he quickly darted his eyes away and busied himself with drinking his wine while I sat down next to him. Neither of us spoke much as we sat outside, aside from the occasional comment or question. But it was a comfortable quietness, and it felt natural, as though we had been doing this for years. Eventually, Edric finished his bottle of wine. When I looked over at him, his cheeks were a bit rosy from the alcohol, and there was a slight smile twitching at the corners of his lips. He seemed a little drunk. "It's getting late," he said then, standing. "We should go to bed." I nodded and went to stand, but before I could, Edric held out his hand for me to take. I took his hand quietly, unsure as to what was happening, but when he led me up the stairs, past my room and over to his room instead, I couldn't help myself from blushing an even deeper shade of red when I realized that he wanted me to stay with him again that night. Do you want to sign another contract?" I whispered, our bodies close in the dark hallway. Edric merely smiled and shook his head. Moana. That night, I fell asleep next to Edric with a full heart. I couldn't help but wonder if all of this meant that our relationship might go further than simply being a fake relationship. But I didn't want to spend too much time getting my hopes up in case things didn't work out as planned. All I knew was that my wolf was happy to be near him, and I was also happy to be near him. Edric seemed happier than usual as well, and it made me think that maybe things would at least be just a little different after our mini vacation at the mountain estate. The next morning, I awoke to the feeling of Edric's warm arms around me. I was turned toward him with my face buried comfortingly in his chest, so close I could feel his heartbeat. We had fallen asleep the night before with a respectable distance between us as we didn't want to get too close, but it seemed that we simply couldn't avoid getting close to one another in our sleep. However, I couldn't deny that feeling him this close to me gave me a sense of safety and comfort. Edric's eyes opened shortly after mine did. He rarely ever slept any longer after I woke up, as though he needed me to be asleep beside him in order for him to sleep as well. I felt my heart begin to race as his gray eyes looked down at me, expecting him to pull away. But he didn't. For several long, quiet minutes, we just looked at each other, as the sun shined on us and the cool, fragrant mountain air wafted in through the open window. His arms stayed firmly wrapped around me, holding me close to his body and keeping me warm in the chilly morning air. He was so much bigger than me, but our bodies fit perfectly together like two puzzle pieces. Neither of us pulled away, in fact, until we suddenly heard a knock on the door. I gasped and quickly moved away with the intention of jumping out of bed and hiding in the closet so as not to be seen, but Edric's hand shot out and wrapped around my wrist, stopping me before I could. "Daddy?" Ella's tiny voice called through the door. "Are you awake?" My eyes widened, but Edric stayed surprisingly calm. "Come in, princess," he said, releasing his grip on my wrist as my heart pounded even harder. How was he not panicking? We weren't together romantically. Or at least, we weren't supposed to be, and therefore we shouldn't have been sleeping in the same bed. It would have been difficult enough already to admit our sleeping arrangement to the maids, let alone Ella. And yet, Edric didn't seem concerned in the slightest. What changed? The door cracked open then, and Ella shuffled in with her stuffed duck under her arm and her hair a mess from sleeping all night. Her tired eyes didn't catch me at first as she walked up to her father's side of the bed, but when they finally did, her jaw dropped. "Moana?" Ella said, rubbing her eyes with one hand. "What are you doing in here?" I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing would come out. However, Edric seemed to have it handled already, and what he said next took me by complete surprise. "Moana and I sleep in the same room now," Edric said matter-of-factly, as though it was only natural for the two of us to sleep together. I was completely taken aback by the fact that he so casually admitted our sleeping arrangement to his daughter, and my heart pounded even harder as I wondered how Ella would react. Would she get the wrong idea and wonder again why we weren't married? Would she resent me and feel as though I was stealing her daddy away from her? Maybe they had a morning ritual of playing together sometimes, and she thought that my presence would only get in the way of her bonding time with her father. Ella was silent for a few moments. Her blue eyes flickered back and forth between Edric and I as she looked at us both, processing what Edric said. I feared the worst. But much to my surprise, Ella merely shrugged and clambered up onto the bed with her stuffed duck in tow. "Okay," she said with a grunt, as she hauled her tiny body up onto the tall bed without any help. She seemed just as nonchalant about the situation as her father. I couldn't quite tell if Edric's own nonchalance made her feel at ease, or if she was simply expecting things like this to happen between Edric and I at this point. "I want to go on a walk today," Ella said, nestling herself down between the two of us with her stuffed duck in her arms. "Can we go?" Edric chuckled. "Sure," he said, "but you'll have to pay the toll first." "The toll?" Ella asked, sitting up again and cocking her head to the side. I watched as Edric grinned. In the morning sunlight, he looked even more handsome with a smile on his face. "Yep," he said, "you have to pay a fee to the tickle monster." "No!" Ella shrieked, but it was already too late. Edric grabbed her and began tickling her furiously, causing her to scream with laughter as she kicked her little legs and threw her stuffed duck in an attempt to get away. "Not the tickle monster!" Edric let out a comical, cartoonish laugh that sounded like an evil villain as he kept playfully terrorizing Ella. I couldn't help but grin and laugh along with them. A rush of emotion for both of them came over me at that moment, and I swore for the briefest of moments that I really did feel like Edric's wife and Ella's mother as I watched them play together. Seeing Edric act so openly and candidly with his daughter made my heart fill with warmth, and as he began tossing Ella in the air and causing her giggles to grow even louder, I couldn't stop smiling. Seeing them like this together made me so happy, and I was glad that we had decided to get out of the city after all. It seemed that a bit of fresh air and a slower pace away from the hustle and bustle and noise of the city was something that we all needed, and I felt my own stress beginning to melt away too. And yet, at the same time, I couldn't deny the fact that there was a tiny pang of confusion deep within me still. As I watched Ella and Edric play together, I was smiling. I loved seeing them like this, and it warmed me to see the once cold and indifferent alpha billionaire acting in such a silly way with his daughter in front of me. But that feeling of confusion was relentless, and it put a bit of a damper on the moment. I just wished that my relationship with Edric didn't have to be so complicated. If only it could be simple, as simple and pure and natural as the love he had for his daughter, Moana. Later that morning, after enjoying breakfast in the garden in the fresh air with Ella and Edric, Ella reminded Edric that she wanted to go for a hike. Edric, of course, agreed, as it was nice outside. "Go put your shoes on," he said, "and pants too. I don't want you falling down in a dress." "Okay," Ella exclaimed as she sprinted off to her room to get changed. Edric stood and stretched, accidentally revealing the lower portion of his abs as he did so. He was dressed casually in a simple polo shirt and trousers, which was strange to see, as I had grown so accustomed to seeing him only dressed in business attire. He must have forgotten that he wasn't wearing his shirt tucked in when he stretched, and seeing even just a small portion of his abs made me blush a deep shade of red. "We won't be out for too long," Edric said then. "Feel free to explore anywhere you want in the mansion or the gardens while we're out." Although the thought of exploring the mansion sounded fun, I furrowed my brow. It was too beautiful outside, and I had been looking forward to going on a nice walk. "I was thinking I would go with you, actually," I said, standing from the table. Edric pursed his lips and looked at me. His eyes traveled down to my belly. He seemed hesitant. "Are you sure it's a good idea?" he asked. "I don't want you to get sick or get hurt if it's too much exertion." I put my hands on my hips and frowned. "I'm only a few months pregnant. I'm not a complete invalid just yet. Besides, it's only a walk." Edric paused and chewed the inside of his lower lip for a few moments before finally nodding. "All right," he replied. "I guess some exercise could be good for you and the baby." I couldn't help but grin. I thought it was sweet that Edric was so concerned about our baby, but I knew that he worried too much when it came to certain things. I had always been somewhat athletic and never had any problems with exercising. Being a few months pregnant may have stopped me from doing crazy things like rock climbing or downhill skiing, but a nice hike through the forest was something that I knew I could handle. Besides, the doctor told me that exercise was extremely healthy for the baby, and I had done enough research of my own to learn that many women could do all sorts of athletic things, even while they were 8 or 9 months pregnant. Once I even read about a woman who was a marathon runner and kept winning marathons up until her water broke. Now that Edric agreed to let me go with them, I quickly ran upstairs and changed out of my dress and into something more suitable for a hike. Once I was ready, I headed back downstairs with Ella's hand in mine and met Edric outside. As we began to follow the path that led into the woods, I couldn't help but notice that Edric kept glancing at me on occasion while we walked. He seemed to be looking at my outfit, and I didn't realize it until a while later that he had never seen me in anything that wasn't purely professional. Now I was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans with boots and a zip-up hoodie on top, with my hair up in a bun, and he almost seemed fascinated by it. Seeing the way he looked at me made me blush and feel a bit embarrassed until I realized that I had looked at him the same way earlier. In a strange way, seeing each other in casual clothing almost felt like another layer of the barrier between us being peeled away. While we walked, I couldn't help but feel relaxed. The cool mountain air smelled sweetly of pine trees as we walked further into the forest, and the quiet sound of the forest around us was extremely relaxing. Every so often, Ella would run ahead with a flower or a cool rock or anything else that she would demand for Edric to keep in his pocket, and soon enough his pockets were bursting with rocks and acorns. Eventually, however, Edric's phone rang. I tried not to look as he pulled it out of his back pocket, but I couldn't keep myself and took a quick peek, only to see that it was none other than his father. As soon as Edric saw his father's name on the screen, his face went dark. Before, he had been smiling and chatting happily, but now he was sullen and gloomy like the flick of a switch. "I'll be right back," he growled. Before I could answer, he stormed off a ways into the woods to answer the phone. Meanwhile, Ella ran in circles around me, picking little wildflowers. I stayed where I was and sat down on a large boulder to rest my feet, keeping an eye on Ella while Edric was busy. I hoped that his father wasn't berating him for announcing our relationship, but I knew that that was probably exactly what was happening. "Here, Moana," Ella said, running up to me. Her fist was full of wildflowers, and she shoved it in my face to show me all of the delicate petals and muted colors. "It's for the baby." I couldn't help but tear up as I took the flowers from Ella. "Ah, love," I said, touching the flowers gently. "Is it really?" Ella nodded vigorously. She said. "I picked lots of daisies, see? And Selena once told me that those flowers are called, She pointed thoughtfully at one of the flowers. It was a cluster of white flowers that were spread out on their stem in an umbrella-like shape, causing the petals to look almost like lace. "Those are called Queen Anne's lace," I said. Ella's eyes lit up. "Yes, Queen Anne's lace," she exclaimed. "If the baby's a girl, I think you should name her after the flowers. Daisy Ann." I smiled. It was a name that I hadn't thought of yet, but it was sweet, and I knew that I wouldn't forget it. Daisy Ann, I liked that name. But then suddenly this sweet moment with Ella was suddenly broken when she gasped and pointed out at something in the distance, her eyes wide. "Moana," she said, taking a few steps backwards. "Wolf?" I quickly jumped up and stood in front of her, looking out toward where she was pointing. Just as Ella said, there was a wolf out there, and it was stalking toward us. It was large and gray with bright yellow eyes that were fixed directly on the both of us. I accidentally dropped the flowers as I quickly grabbed Ella's hand and backed away, keeping her behind me. "Stay behind me, Ella," I said, feeling a knot form in my throat. The wolf was coming straight for us, as though it had a mission to come for us. And the closer the wolf got, the more I could hear its low, threatening growls rumbling in its throat. If this wolf decided to attack us, Ella and I would be defenseless. As I opened my mouth, I only hoped that Edric was still close enough to hear me when I called his name. "Edric, help!" Edric. If I thought that Moana looked beautiful in her new dress the night before, then she looked even more stunning now dressed plainly in hiking clothes. I had never seen her dressed so casually before, and although I couldn't quite put my finger on why I felt this way, I felt even more attracted to her when she was dressed like this. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that for a moment, as the three of us walked together and enjoyed nature away from the noise and the chaos of the city, it almost felt as though we were a normal little family that was simply out for a hike on a nice summer's morning. I had never told anyone this before, but I had never particularly enjoyed following in my father's footsteps. I always knew that it was expected of me from a very young age, but I had secretly always envied other boys who didn't have such high expectations. In college, as I watched my friends go on to follow their dreams and become artists or teachers or adventurers, I resented the fact that my path was set in stone, that was laid down by someone else before me. I never even had a say in it. No matter how much I just wanted to play the piano and enjoy being young and free, I had no choice but to become the next WearCorp CEO, and I got used to it for the most part. But ever since I met Moana, it was times like this that reminded me that I just wanted a quiet life. Sure, the money was nice, but I wanted to live here all of the time, not in the city. I only really lived there most of the time to be close to WearCorp. It was times like this, which were rare, when I realized just how much I hated being a CEO. And seeing Moana in jeans and a hoodie, with her curly red hair piled on top of her head, and with Ella running ahead of us and collecting little rocks and things to line up on her windowsill, made me feel at peace. If only we didn't have to go back and return to the city. That spell was quickly broken, however, by the feeling of my phone vibrating. When I saw my father's name on the screen, I almost considered declining the call. But I knew that it would only make things worse. And he was already too mad at me for everything. Even though it broke our peace, I knew that I needed to do some damage control. I didn't want Moana or Ella to overhear my conversation with my father and ruin our walk, so I quickly excused myself and walked off out of earshot before I answered. "Hello?" I answered. Of course, just as I expected, my father didn't even bother to greet me before he started laying into me. "I can't believe that my own son would cause so much trouble," he growled, without so much as a hello. "You've done nothing but create scandal after scandal recently. Are you going to take control of yourself, or do I need to take control for you?" I froze, feeling my blood run cold at my father's harsh words. And in that moment, maybe I was a bit disrespectful as well when I said the first thing that came to my mind. "You do have another son, you know," I replied, feeling myself fill with fire as I spoke. "Why don't you appoint him as Weir Corp CEO?" My father scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous," he snarled, "and control your temper, not just with me but with others. At the very least, control your temper in public. I could care less what you do at home." I knew that he was talking about the incident where I punched the paparazzi the day before, but I didn't care. If anything, that whole incident helped us teach the paparazzi a lesson, and I was only doing what any father would do to protect his daughter and the mother of his unborn child. In fact, I opened my mouth to say that, but quickly stopped when I suddenly heard my name being called. "Edric! Help!" Moana. Her voice sounded scared. I didn't waste a moment before abruptly hanging up the phone and taking off at a sprint toward Moana and Ella, my mind racing with a million possibilities. Had Ella fallen and gotten hurt? Had Moana gotten hurt? However, it was much different than that. When I finally burst back out onto the trail and found Moana and Ella, they were both cowering behind a boulder, shaking and crying. Moana pointed to something that made my blood run cold. It was a wolf. And it wasn't just any wolf. It was a rogue in its wolf form. I could smell it. Without a moment of hesitation, I jumped in front of Moana and Ella and did what any protective alpha would do. I growled, deep and low. I could feel my eyes begin to glow, and I awakened my wolf in case I would need to shift and fight this thing off. But thankfully, the rogue seemed to take the hint. In a cowardly fashion, as soon as it heard my growl, it turned tail and took off into the woods like a bolt of lightning. Once it was gone, I quickly turned around and ran over to Moana and Ella, reassuring them that it was okay, but we needed to leave. I picked up Ella and carried her while Moana followed alongside me, and I instinctively reached out and wrapped my free arm around Moana as well, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to make sure that the rogue didn't decide to come back for more. Thankfully, my growl seemed to scare it off for good. But regardless, I couldn't shake that feeling of impending danger. The mountain estate was secluded, and it wasn't entirely unfeasible for strangers to accidentally stumble onto the vast property. But this seemed deliberate. When I found them, the wolf was stalking straight toward them as though it was on a mission. Like someone sent it here. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but the whole thing felt suspicious. The timing was too perfect. Just moments after I walked away and left Ella and Moana alone in the woods, a rogue suddenly appeared and seemed to have its sights set on them. I wondered for a moment if it had something to do with the fact that Moana was special, and that she was even possibly the golden wolf. But it didn't make any sense. She didn't have a continuous scent yet, and I would have noticed if she had suddenly released her scent. Not only that, but her scent would have repelled the rogue. No, this felt different, but I couldn't quite explain why. Either way, I didn't feel safe here anymore, and neither did Ella and Moana. Even though I wanted to stay here in the peace and quiet forever, I knew that staying in our urban penthouse would be safer until I got to the bottom of this, and knew that Moana would be safe, so I decided to have everyone pack up early and head home that night. At first, I thought Moana would be upset that we had to leave so early, but thankfully, she only agreed with me. I knew that she had an intuition that something was wrong too. Moana. Even though I was enjoying spending time at the mountain estate, it seemed that maybe it wasn't very safe here right now. Edric didn't say much about it, but he seemed to be worried ever since that wolf came after Ella and myself, and I couldn't help but wonder if he knew something that I didn't. I trusted Edric to make the right decisions, so when he told me that it was best for us to return to the penthouse for now, I agreed. My only regret was that I didn't have any time to paint while we were there, and I hoped that I would have another chance to paint soon. When we finally arrived back at the penthouse, it was already late that night. Selena and the maids prepared a quick meal, but I was too tired and uneasy after what happened to have much of an appetite and only wanted to go to sleep. Ella was hardly keeping her eyes open, too, so I put her to bed before heading over to Edric's room to get some sleep myself. I couldn't stop myself from feeling worried, though. Edric had been extremely quiet ever since what happened in the forest. In fact, he had been quiet ever since his father called him that morning. I couldn't help but wonder if it was because of me and if this would mean that he would distance himself from me again. "Don't worry," Mina said, noticing my anxiety. "He'll come around. He just needs a little time. But I know that he cares about you deeply, so you shouldn't worry about it too much." Even though I wasn't entirely sure if I believed Mina, I supposed that she had never been wrong about this sort of thing before. Maybe she was right. Maybe Edric just needed a little time to come around and sort some things out. He had already shown me so many times just how much he cared about me. The way he treated me at the mountain estate, even after the horrible things I said to him when he announced our relationship, and after I put Ella and my baby in danger by being exposed to the paparazzi, he had still treated me lovingly, almost like his real wife. Even as I laid there now, waiting for him to come to bed, I could still feel his warm arms around me from that morning, and I could still see the softness in his eyes. However, as I laid there waiting for Edric, he never came to bed. I found that it was becoming more and more difficult to sleep without him ever since the incident in the Rogue District, and so I stayed awake in bed, waiting for him with my eyes fixed on the canopy above the bed. It was well after midnight now, and I still hadn't seen or heard him, so I began to get worried. I thought that maybe he fell asleep at his desk or got too absorbed in work to notice what time it was, so I quietly got out of bed and threw my robe on before walking out into the living room. Just as I suspected, Edric was still in his study. I could see a little bit of light pouring out from underneath the door, and I walked over to knock and see why he wasn't coming to bed. But before I could, I froze when I heard him talking to someone. His voice was raised, and it sounded strained and frustrated. "I know you sent that thing," Edric growled, sounding exasperated. "Just admit it. Were you just trying to scare them, or are you actually such a horrible person that you would try to hurt a pregnant woman and a child?" Edric paused, as though he was listening. Was he talking to his father? It sounded as though he was referring to the incident with the wolf earlier that day. I had thought that it was just a random wolf that happened to stumble upon us in the woods, but judging from the way that Edric was talking about it, I realized that maybe it wasn't so simple as that. I froze as I heard what he said next. "I knew it. You're not going to get your way. Not with me here to protect them. If you want to hurt them, you'll have to hurt me first, Dad." My eyes widened. So he was talking to his father. Had his father really sent a wolf, a rogue, possibly, to attack us? I suppose that I should have expected that he wanted to hurt me. I was, after all, a threat to his family's image, but to put his granddaughter, as well as an unborn child, in harm's way. It made me sick. I instinctively put my hand over my belly protectively, as though that would be any help if Michael were to try to harm us again, and wondered if he would only continue to be a threat even after my baby was born. As long as Michael was alive, would we ever feel completely safe if he was really so cruel as to put a child and a pregnant woman in harm's way? Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of Edric slamming the phone down. I bit my lip as I stood there in the darkness outside his study door, wondering if I should go in there and talk to him. I knew that he needed someone to be there for him, and I understood his frustrations. If I could only show him that he could be open with me, then I knew he would feel better. He was putting too much pressure on himself by not talking about these things, and I needed him to understand that he didn't need to take his father on alone when he had me. I decided then that I would go in there and talk to him, but just as I was about to put my hand out to knock on the door, I heard him speak again. "Olivia," he said, sounding even more exasperated than before. "What do you want now? It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning." I froze once more. This Olivia person... Again, who was she, and why was she always calling Edric in the middle of the night? I thought back to the night that we kissed in the kitchen, when he mentioned that someone from his past always called relentlessly around this time of year, and I knew that it was Olivia. But I still didn't understand why. Was she an ex-girlfriend? A family member? An estranged friend? "Not this again," he growled. "I've given you enough. Stop calling me." Edric suddenly hung up then. I felt my heart leap into my throat, and out of instinct, I quickly ran out of the room and jumped back into Edric's bed before he could realize that I was eavesdropping. But as I laid there, pretending to be asleep while Edric quietly entered the room, finally, and got ready for bed, I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had heard. Why was Edric's father so hell-bent on harming me, even going so far as to put his granddaughter and his second unborn grandchild in harm's way? Would any of us be safe so long as he was in the picture? And secondly, who was Olivia, and why was she calling Edric so much? Moana. I woke up the next morning with the memory of what I overheard still fresh on my mind. To not only hear that Michael had sent that wolf to attack us, but also to hear that Olivia called Edric again, left me feeling both confused and scared. If my baby was going to be in danger of someone like Michael, I didn't know what I would do. I could only trust that Edric would handle it and keep us protected. It was Saturday morning, which meant that it was also a training day for Ella. I woke up early to get her ready and decided that I would go to the orphanage and volunteer while Ella was in training. The last time I was at the orphanage, I discovered that Sophia was in need of help. So I decided that I would spend every Saturday morning that I could helping her out. I just hoped that she wouldn't be too upset with me for not telling her about the baby sooner, as I was certain that she likely saw the news by now. I'm going to the orphanage while Ella is in training today, I told Edric as we ate breakfast together. I'll be volunteering for Sophia on Saturdays now. Edric furrowed his brow as he took a sip of his coffee. He seemed a bit concerned, which I understood. With everything that had happened recently between the rogue district and the rogue that came to attack us in the woods, it was no wonder that he was worried about letting me spend time out of the house by myself. "Well, at least bring a bodyguard with you," he said somewhat sternly. "I don't want you going anywhere alone from now on." I agreed, only because I was constantly reminding myself of Edric's phone call with Michael the night before. But on the way to Ella's training and then the orphanage after that, I couldn't deny the fact that I felt a bit uncomfortable having a bodyguard follow me around. However, I knew that it was the safest thing to do, and the bodyguard that Edric hired was very nice. In fact, as I sat down at the front desk and began my work for Sophia, I couldn't help but smile when I heard the children pestering the bodyguard and making him play with them. Sophia, just as I suspected, was a little sullen when she saw me. "I do wish that you told me sooner, sir," she said, setting a cup of tea down on the desk in front of me. "I would have preferred to hear it from you instead of from the news." I felt myself blush a bit. "I know," I replied. "I'm sorry. I didn't know that Edric was going to announce it like that." Sophia sighed, then shrugged. Finally, a bit of a smile spread across her face, and she reached out from across the desk to squeeze my hand. "I'm happy for you. You're going to make a wonderful mother." Sophia's words made me smile. She didn't mention my relationship with Edric, however, which was a relief. I didn't feel like I was in the mood to explain that entire mess to anyone, let alone Sophia, although I was certain that she already had a good idea as to what was really going on anyway. After the past week, I felt even more confused about my relationship with Edric than ever. I just hoped that Mina was right when she told me that I just needed to give Edric time, and then he would want to have more than a fake relationship. If it was going to be confusing like this forever, I wasn't so sure if I would be able to handle it, let alone how our future child would handle it. How could I explain to our son or daughter that their mommy and daddy weren't really married, but were instead only pretending to be? I couldn't imagine that going well. Thankfully, however, I was able to stop thinking about these things and keep myself busy with work for a few hours. The phone rang almost non-stop. It seemed that Edric's foundation was bringing a lot of attention to the orphanage, and there were a lot of couples who wanted to get started with the adoption process. Not only that, but there were a lot of potential donors who called to make appointments so they could tour the orphanage, as well as other people who wanted to volunteer. Between all of the phone calls and workers coming in to make repairs thanks to the money from the foundation, I was busy non-stop during the few hours that I was there. No wonder Sophia was having a hard time keeping up. Working at the front desk was a full-time job in and of itself. Everything went smoothly for the few hours that I was there, or at least it did, up until the very end. It was only a few minutes before I had to leave to pick up Ella. The phone calls had died down a bit, so I was getting ready to leave. Just before I got up from the desk, however, the phone rang one last time and I answered. "Bayside Orphanage," I answered politely. "How can I help you?" "Hi," a cheerful female voice said on the other end. She sounded young, about my age. "I'd like to make an appointment. I'm interested in adopting." I smiled, thrilled once more to hear that more people were interested in adopting. It made my heart swell to know that some of the children who were here would finally be going to homes with loving families. "Sure," I replied, opening up the appointment book. "What's your name?" "Olivia." My blood suddenly ran cold. This couldn't possibly be the Olivia, could it? The same Olivia who called Edric relentlessly in the middle of the night? It couldn't be. This woman sounded perfectly nice, not at all like the disturbance that Edric made her out to be. I couldn't imagine that the lovely young woman on the other end of the phone was the same woman who pestered Edric for money on an almost nightly basis. Surely it was just a coincidence. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I decided that it was really just nothing but a coincidence. Olivia wasn't an uncommon name after all, and that I was just being paranoid. "Okay, Olivia," I said as I looked through the appointment book. "Can you come in on Wednesday next week at 10 o'clock in the morning?" The young woman paused for a few moments before answering. Actually, can I come in on a Saturday? I work all week." Sure," I replied. "I'll put you in for next Saturday at 10 o'clock. Olivia thanked me and we hung up. I kept telling myself that it really was just a coincidence, but something in me felt as though there was something fishy about all of this. Was it possible that Olivia was an ex-girlfriend of Edric's who found out about our relationship and wanted to confront me in person? No, I thought to myself as I followed the bodyguard out to the car to go and pick up Ella. You're just being paranoid. And so I swallowed the odd feeling of dread in my throat and left to pick up Ella from training, deciding that the Olivia who just called the orphanage was simply nothing more than a coincidence. Moana. By the time I picked up Ella and took her home, I had almost completely forgotten about the woman named Olivia who called the orphanage. Ella and I spent the remainder of the afternoon drawing and playing in the penthouse, and by the time that dinner time came around, I was too tired and hungry after my long day to think about much of anything. "Let's get ready for dinner, Ella," I said. I wasn't sure what Selena and the maids planned on preparing for dinner that night, but I looked forward to sitting down and relaxing a bit. I helped Ella clean up her coloring books and toys, then had her wash her hands and clean herself up before we headed back out to the dining room to eat. However, when we walked into the dining room, I was surprised to find that there was no dinner. In fact, when I poked my head into the kitchen, it didn't seem that Selena and the maids were preparing anything at all. The three of them were seated around the kitchen island with tea and their own meals, but nothing else had been prepared. I was about to open my mouth to ask if I should prepare something for myself and Ella, which I didn't mind doing at all, when I suddenly heard the elevator doors open and Edric's voice came bellowing through the penthouse. "I brought pizza," he called. As he spoke, I could already smell it, and my mouth instantly began to water. I hadn't had pizza in ages, but even more than that, I was surprised to hear that the alpha billionaire actually bought takeout pizza for dinner. "Yay! Pizza party!" Ella shouted. She took off running into her bedroom, leaving me standing in the middle of the dining room with a puzzled expression on my face. Edric came in then and set the pizza down on the table. "What are you doing still dressed?" he asked, eyeing me. "Put your pajamas on. It's time for a pizza party." I was utterly shocked. Not only had the maids and Selena not mentioned that we were supposed to be having a pizza party tonight, but I was also shocked to find that Edric wanted us to eat in our pajamas. But before I could ask why, Edric walked out of the dining room and disappeared into his own bedroom. I could only stare at Selena and the maids in shock. Selena chuckled when she saw the confused look on my face. "He does this every so often," she said. It makes Ella happy." Oh, I was still taken aback, but it made sense that Edric might want to make Ella happy after all of the stress she'd been through lately. I decided not to question it any further and went to my room to put on a set of pajamas that I felt comfortable wearing in front of everybody, then headed back out to the living room to see that Edric and Ella were already seated on the floor in front of the television with plates of pizza in their hands. "Come sit and grab some pizza," Edric said, nodding his head toward a cushion on the floor that he set out for me. "Ella, do you want to pick out a movie?" As I sat down sheepishly and picked up a plate of cheesy, gooey pizza that made my mouth water even more, Ella puzzled over which movie to pick until she finally landed on an animated children's movie with talking animals. Together, the three of us sat on the floor and watched the movie while we ate pizza. Even though it felt a bit awkward at first to do something so casual with the alpha billionaire, I couldn't deny the fact that it was a lot of fun. With my belly full of delicious pizza, there was a bit of a smile on my face as I occasionally glanced over at Ella and Edric sitting together in the dark room with only the glow of the television to illuminate them. Eventually, we moved from the floor to the couch, and Edric held Ella tightly in his arms while she watched the movie. In an odd way, just in the same way that it felt when we hiked together in our casual close, it felt both strange and comforting to see this relaxed and playful side of Edric. I had never seen him do anything so spontaneous like this, and during those moments it really did feel like we were a normal little family enjoying quality time together. I couldn't help but rest my hand on my belly as we sat and watched the movie, thinking about how we would soon have another addition to our makeshift family for nights like this, no matter how rare they were. Besides, seeing how sweet and caring Edric was with Ella warmed my heart, as I thought about how he would treat our child the same way. Even though our relationship was still complicated, it was a relief to know that I was bringing a child into a world with a man who cared so deeply about his children, even though he didn't seem like the type when I first met him. I couldn't help but wonder, though, if he really was like this when I met him, and that he just didn't show it, or if he relaxed more since I met him. Just a few months ago, he was a cold and ruthless alpha billionaire who seemed to spend all of his time working and hardly paid any attention to Ella. But now, here he was, spontaneously bringing home pizza and watching children's movies on the couch in his pajamas. Not only that, but to think about how sweet he had been when he took us to the mountain estate, even though it wound up going wrong in the end, made me think even more that the Alpha CEO was becoming more and more of a family man by the day. And in a lot of ways, it made me feel safe in knowing that I made the right decision to keep our baby and stay here with him and Ella. At one point, I must have spent too much time looking over at Edric in the darkness, watching how handsome his face looked even in the dim blue glow of the television, and he seemed to notice me looking. He glanced over at me, but I didn't look away at first, and we held our gaze for a long few moments. During those moments, I felt Mina reacting strongly inside of me. I knew that she wanted me to get closer to Edric, but at the same time, I still felt too confused by what our relationship had become to feel completely comfortable just yet. So I quickly looked away, hoping that he didn't see how red my face became during those moments. By the time the movie ended, Ella was half asleep with her belly full of pizza. Edric carried her to bed, and I couldn't help but follow behind when he disappeared into her room. Through the crack in the door, I watched as he laid her down in her bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. "Daddy?" Ella asked, her tiny voice sleepy. "Yes, princess?" he asked. Ella yawned. "Can we have more pizza parties?" Edric paused. I felt my heart flutter to see this interaction between father and daughter, and felt my heart flutter even more at his response. "Sure, princess," he said gently, kissing her forehead. "We can have lots of pizza parties from now on. You, me, and Moana. Hearing how sweetly Edric spoke to Ella made my heart swell, and to hear him mention me, too, made my heart swell even more. Was my wolf right when she said that Edric would come around? These past few days, did his attitude toward our relationship begin to shift in the right direction? I heard Edric kiss Ella goodnight and approach the door, so I quickly scurried away before he realized that I was eavesdropping. I wasn't sure whether he actually saw me or not, but if he did, he didn't say anything about it. When we climbed into bed that night, however, I still couldn't wipe the smile off of my face. "What is it?" Edric asked, watching me as I climbed into bed. "You've been smiling nonstop all night." I shrugged and laid down next to him, not sure if I wanted to openly say that I was smiling because our little pizza party made me feel even more strongly about him and that I wanted us to be a real family. I wasn't sure how he would take it. It was a cool night out, and the balcony doors were wide open to let in the cool summer breeze. Outside, the city was noisy as always, and it felt even more noisy after our couple of days in the mountains. "I just want to say thank you for everything you've done for me lately," I finally said. "You've been giving me such a nice time." Edric fell silent for a few moments. I thought for a second that he might make some sort of indifferent comment that would allude to his old self, but much to my surprise, he didn't. It really did seem as though the alpha billionaire was changing for the better lately. Or maybe he was just more comfortable being open these days. "I only want to make you happy," he said finally. His voice was low and soft, and the way he spoke gave me instant butterflies in my stomach. "I'm glad you're comfortable here." I didn't know what to say. His words were so sweet and seemed so heartfelt that it made me blush, and I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing would come out. However, it seemed that I didn't need to say anything at all. I felt Mina react even more strongly than ever at Edric's words, as though the way he spoke almost made her go feral. And then, in that same instant, Edric suddenly rolled over to face me. He pushed himself up on his hand and cupped my cheek with the other, his steely gray eyes glowing a bright silver like I had never seen before. The air between us was electrified, and I felt somehow attracted to him and nervous at the same time. I opened my mouth to ask him what he was doing so suddenly, but before anything could come out, he suddenly pressed his lips against mine, with a fervence that I had never experienced before. His sweet lips parted gently, and his tongue pressed its way into my mouth while his hand traveled down my neck, over my collarbone and my shoulder, down my waist and landed on my hip, where his fingers squeezed gently and dug into my flesh, causing tingling sensations to shoot through my body like lightning bolts. I wanted him so badly. I couldn't explain it, but I wanted him more now than ever, as though he was the one thing I needed in life, like oxygen. I kissed him back with the same amount of passion, our lips never parting, and I pressed my hands into his chest. My fingers worked open the buttons on his shirt and slid beneath the fabric to feel his smooth skin, and at the same time I felt his hand slide lower on my hip onto my thigh. So many emotions took over me then. Passion, heat, desire, but above all else, love. It was the same way that I felt when I saw his face in the alleyway, saving me from the rogues. When he picked me up and all I saw was him looking down at me, his eyes fixed unwaveringly on me. I knew I loved him then, and I loved him now. I didn't want a fake relationship with Edric. I wanted a real one. I wanted this all along, and now it was finally becoming a reality. I could tell from the way that he gently yet firmly touched me, and the way that his lips worked their way across my jaw and down my neck, that he felt the same way. But then it ended almost as quickly as it began. Edric suddenly sat up, ripping his hands away from me with wide eyes. I propped myself up on my elbows while I watched him quickly button his shirt back up, my own eyes wide with disbelief. "Edric, what's wrong?" I whispered, my throat choking up already. Edric only shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said, standing suddenly. "I got carried away. I shouldn't have done that." My lower lip began to quiver as he stormed over to the door. "But, Edric," I called after him, sitting up fully now, but he was already gone. I could only stare at the door in disbelief, wondering if I did something wrong. Even if I went after him, I knew that I wouldn't even get an answer. Was being intimate with me really such a mistake that he couldn't even look me in the eye afterwards? Even though he knew that I was a werewolf now, were our differences in social status and all of the scandals surrounding us too much for him to want to be with me romantically? Suddenly, as a sob caught in my throat, I heard my wolf's voice echo inside my head. "I'm sorry," she said, sounding somewhat ashamed. "That was my fault." I shook my head and wiped the tears out of my eyes with the back of my hand. "What happened?" I asked. Everything seemed fine, and then, like I said, it was my fault. I think Edric might be our mate. I know I should have asked you first, but I got too curious, and you two seemed so close, so I released my scent. It made him lose control. My eyes widened as I processed what Mina had just said. Was it true? Edric may have really been our mate? But if he was, why wouldn't he just be intimate with me instead of tearing himself away and running out of the room like that? Surely, if he was my mate, he would have felt the same way. Were the differences between us really so vast that he couldn't even bring himself to be with his own mate? "He'll come around," Mina said comfortingly. "I promise. Just give him some time. I think I just released too much scent at once, and it overwhelmed him." I sighed and flopped back onto the mattress as I stared up at the ceiling. "I hope you're right," I whispered out loud. "I really hope you're right." But that night, Edric didn't come back to bed. Moana. The next morning, I awoke with a pounding headache. I felt more confused now than ever with my relationship with Edric. If my wolf really was right about Edric being my mate, then it only made all of this even more complicated. I couldn't help but wonder, too, if Edric also knew that I was his mate and that he wasn't telling me about it. But I couldn't imagine why he would want to keep something like that a secret from me. I finally got out of bed and made my way out into the living room, expecting Edric to be locked away in his study after what happened the night before. But, much to my surprise, he wasn't. In fact, he was standing in the living room and looking out the window when I walked in. As I approached, he turned to face me directly without even a hint of remorse or embarrassment on his face. "Sorry for the late notice," he said, glancing at his watch, "but I just found out that I'll need to go to a networking event tonight. You'll need to be there as my fiancée, of course. Selena will keep an eye on Ella tonight." My eyes widened. A public event?" I asked. The thought of going out into public with Edric as his fiancée made me nervous, especially after all of the media attention we were already receiving. As our debut as a couple, it would no doubt be even more chaotic. "Yes," Edric replied. "Well, sort of. There will be paparazzi outside, but once we get in, it won't be so bad. It'll only be other socialites and business people." I wasn't sure if Edric thought that telling me that the event would only be other rich people was supposed to make me feel better, but it didn't. My heart was already racing just thinking about how out of place I would feel as the only human there. Of course, I was a werewolf like the rest of them, but they didn't know that. To them, I was still just a lowly human. And I was sure that many of them agreed with the sentiment that I was a human plaything, too. However, I knew that I didn't have much of a choice. Edric had already made it clear the other night that I would have to play the role of his fiancée, and that meant that I couldn't always be hidden away. I would need to attend things like this with him for appearances, even though it freaked me out. At least now I had some hope that Edric really was my mate, though, which would mean that maybe in the future these sorts of things wouldn't need to be fake anymore. Okay, I choked out, my face going red as Edric's steely gaze stayed fixed on me, reminding me of the night before. "What time will I need to be ready?" "The event starts at 7 o'clock tonight," Edric replied. "I booked an appointment for you with Tyrus to do your hair and makeup at 4. I nodded in understanding. Having my hair and makeup professionally done for public events like this would still take some getting used to, but I did like Tyrus and enjoyed talking to him. Besides, I couldn't help but think that it was a bit sweet that Edric hired his old college friend for this. I had never envisioned Edric as someone who seemed to have many friends, and I never was sure if Edric would be open to talking about his past, so talking to Tyrus was like looking through a window into Edric's old life. Like clockwork, Tyrus came at exactly 4 o'clock to do my hair and makeup. "You look stunning in green and gold," he said as he did my eyeshadow in front of my vanity mirror. "Or maybe I'm just biased because those are my favorite colors." I couldn't help but laugh. Tyrus was right, though. Green and gold went perfectly with my hair and skin tone, and when he was finished, I was awed yet again by his work. He gave me a subtle, sage green eyeshadow with flecks of gold in it, as well as subtle pinkish lipstick that looked natural. My hair was pulled back into a half bun with curls that came down on either side to frame my face, and he even took the extra effort to add tiny delicate braids woven with green thread in my hair. With the simple black satin dress that I wore to the end of summer banquet, which had of course been carefully dry cleaned after my stint in the fountain, I felt like a wealthy socialite myself. Once I was ready, Tyrus held out his hand for me and led me out to the living room where Edric waited for me. "Ta-da!" Tyrus exclaimed, gesturing to me with a flourish. "The belle of the ball." Edric stood from the couch to look at me. It was only a brief second, but I swore that his eyes widened slightly and I felt myself blush. Tyrus gestured with his finger for me to spin, and I did. And when I stopped, Edric's face was a little red as well. He kind of looked like a nervous, love-struck schoolboy as he stared at me, which almost made me giggle. Shortly before 7 o'clock, Edric and I took the car to the event. Both of us were silent for the ride. I was too nervous to speak, and Edric didn't seem to want to look at me for too long, although I thought I caught him glancing on occasion. But when the driver pulled up to the event, I heard myself let out an accidental gasp. The event was held at a huge theater with marble pillars out front and a long red carpet that led up the pathway, up the steps, and to the front door. There were other people walking up the red carpet, and I noticed instantly that many of them stopped to pose for the mobs of paparazzi. The women were dressed in extremely luxurious gowns with not a single hair out of place, and all of the men were dressed in perfectly pressed tuxedos of various colors. Even though I knew I was dressed well, I already felt out of place. And not to mention the dozens, hundreds even, of paparazzi crowding around on either side of the red carpet. Edric must have seen my expression, because he suddenly reached out and took my hand. "Don't worry," he said while the driver got out and came around to open our door. "Just stay with me." I couldn't help but blush as I felt Edric's warm hand around mine, but I nodded and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Edric got out of the car first, then held out his arm for me and helped me out. The instant we set foot on the carpet, the paparazzi turned their attention to us, their bright lights flashing and their voices shouting, "Moana, look over here!" I heard them shout, "Mr. Morgan, over here. Just smile and walk with me," Edric said through a fake smile as he waved politely at the paparazzi. I gulped and did as he said. But I was already stunned, and I imagined that I would look more terrified than anything when I eventually saw some of those photos of us. I felt myself become dizzy as we slowly made our way up the red carpet, and I instinctively put my hand on my belly, which, of course, attracted even more attention. "Moana, show us the baby bump," the paparazzi shouted as their flashing lights blinded me. I felt myself begin to choke up and my smile faded. The only thing that kept me from freezing on the spot was the feeling of Edric's arm wrapping protectively around my shoulders. "Edric." As soon as I saw the look on Moana's face as the paparazzi swarmed us, I knew that I should have prepared her more for an event of this magnitude. It wasn't just any old event, it was a huge networking event for some of the most affluent people in the city. The majority of people in attendance were other CEOs, celebrities, and extremely wealthy werewolf socialites. It really was no place for a girl like Moana, who had very little experience with events of this caliber, and I should have given her more time to get used to all of the media attention before I suddenly sprung this on her. But I had completely forgotten that the event was this weekend, and had mistaken the date as being the following weekend. I could tell that Moana was trying her best to smile for the cameras and stay close to me, but when the paparazzi noticed her holding her belly and began to swarm her even more, it became too much. Instinctively, I put my arm around her, but that only sent the paparazzi into even more of a frenzy. "When is the wedding?" The paparazzi shouted. "Will you wait until after the baby is born? When is the baby due?" Of course, I wasn't going to answer any of these questions, not only because there would be no wedding, but also because I needed to get Moana inside before she had a full-blown panic attack out here. The paparazzi, thankfully, were being held behind a barrier and couldn't get too close to us, but it still felt suffocating with all of the flashing lights and shouting. I was used to this by now, and even this was too much. I could only imagine the terror that Moana felt right now. "Come on," I said, guiding her toward the door with my arm still wrapped firmly around her shoulder, as I used my body to block the view that the paparazzi had of her. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of getting any more photos of Moana in such a vulnerable state. They already had too many. We're almost there. Finally, we made it up the steps and to the front door. The bouncer ushered us in, and once the door was shut firmly behind us, the din of the paparazzi outside became muffled, and it finally felt as though we could breathe. But that was only the beginning of the night. The paparazzi were abrasive and annoying, but wealthy werewolf socialites and CEOs were just as bad, if not worse, just in a different way. I stopped Moana in the entryway before we went inside to give us some time to regroup, and held her by both shoulders as my eyes frantically searched her face. She had gone completely pale as a sheet, and her eyes were wide and blinking slowly. I could tell that she was not only blinded by all of the flashing lights, but she was also out of it mentally from all of the noise and attention. "Are you okay?" I asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear without even thinking about it. "Do you need water?" Moana only nodded. She still seemed too stunned to speak, so I decided to get her seated at our table and get her something cold to drink. There would be meals provided later as well as live entertainment, but for now, people were socializing before the show, and our only option was the open bar. I led Moana over to our table, which was marked with a placard that read, "Mr. Morgan and guest," which made me a little annoyed. I knew that my engagement with Moana was fake, but it still felt a little insulting that her name wasn't even on the placard. Instead, she was just a guest. But I decided not to let it get to me. "I'll get you some water and I'll be right back," I said, squeezing her shoulder as she sat down. Moana nodded and offered me a weak smile, which was a relief. She seemed to be a bit more relaxed now that we were inside where it was cooler and quieter. I just hoped that no one would bother her tonight. I knew that some of these people could be nasty, especially to humans, and none of them knew yet that she was a werewolf. As I stood at the bar and waited for the bartender to pour Moana's water and prepare my own drink, I immediately got a taste of the nastiness from some of the other nearby socialites. "Oh, look at that," one woman said to another, as though I wasn't even standing right there. "It's the human plaything." Immediately, I felt my blood boil. The event had barely even begun, and already these gossips were beginning to dig in their claws. I cast a glance over my shoulder at Moana, who was still sitting by herself. I was just glad that no one decided to bother her while I was gone. "Well, I guess she is somewhat pretty," the second woman replied with a snicker. "Although I wonder how pretty she'd be without all of that expensive makeup and that fancy dress." The first woman giggled. "Maybe she's not as dumb as they say," she whispered. "Kudos to her for swindling a billionaire into spoiling her." The bartender handed me my drinks. As I gripped the glasses and began to walk away, all I could do was keep willing myself not to spin around and yell at these two women. I recognized them easily, too. The first one was the much younger trophy wife of one of my business partners, and the second was a B-list actress who ended her prime years ago. I could have said both of those things to those nasty women, but I decided not to for Moana's sake, as I knew it would only make things worse for her, and right now my priority was to get her some water. But when I heard what the women said next, I froze. "I suppose we've all had the occasional interest in humans," the trophy wife said. "But it never lasts. They're simply lesser than us. Their little brains simply can't comprehend the power of a mate bond, and that's why they're only good for experimenting, sexually, if you know what I mean." The second woman, the actress, giggled, but I was fuming. I spun around then and strode up to the two women whose eyes widened as I stopped in front of them. "If you have something to say about my fiancé, then you can say it to me," I said, my anger rising so quickly that it took all of my strength to not say more. The women's faces went red. They both began to stammer out excuses, but I didn't care to hear them. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked back to my table to give Moana her water, and as I did, I made the decision to not leave her side again that night. I realized something, though, as I sat back down with Moana. When I referred to her as my fiancée to those two women, I didn't even think about it. In fact, calling Moana my fiancée felt more natural than anything, Moana. Edric showed so much affection for me when he realized that I was freezing up in front of the paparazzi, and without a moment of hesitation, he shielded me from the cameras with his body to hide my vulnerability and ushered me inside. Once we were safely inside, he led me over to a table and left me there while he got me some water. Even though I was still stunned by all of the shouting and the flashing cameras, I couldn't deny the fact that my heart felt full of love for the man who always cared so deeply about me. While I waited for him, I began to calm down a bit and take in my surroundings. The inside of the building was a beautiful old concert hall with round tables scattered around, an Art Deco ceiling, and an ornate wooden stage at the front. There was a microphone and a stool sitting on the stage, and it made me realize that there must be a live show tonight. I hoped it was a comedian. I needed to laugh. But as I sat, I still couldn't help but notice that people were talking about me. I could hear their whispers and their snickers, and as I looked around, I realized that there were many sets of eyes on me, watching me like hawks circling their prey. It almost seemed as though they were suspicious of me, as if I would steal something or cause some trouble. All I could do was stare down at my lap and wait for Edric to return. As soon as he returned, he put his arm around me once again. The people whispering about me immediately stopped as soon as they saw him, which made me feel safe once more. "Thank you," I said quietly. Edric merely nodded. "Let me know if you need another," he said. He seemed so nonchalant, but I could tell from the way that his jaw was clenched that he was annoyed about something, and the way that he held me tightly was almost territorial. Maybe he noticed that people were staring too and wanted to show them that he would be here to protect me if they tried to say or do anything nasty. Not long later, waiters dressed in black and white uniforms came around and started taking people's orders. There was a limited menu, but each meal was extremely luxurious and decadent. I ordered pasta with clams, and when it came out, I was awed by how fragrant and full of flavor the meal was. I had never eaten such exquisite foods in my life. Sure, Sophia tried her best to give us a wide variety of foods to try, but we never had the money for food like this. As I glanced around at all of the other women who hardly even touched their meals, I felt culture shocked. I still couldn't wrap my head around the fact that there were people who were so used to this that they didn't even want to eat the food, and I decided then and there that no matter how much Edric spoiled me, I would never let myself forget what it was like to go hungry as a child. Once the meals came out, the lights dimmed so that the only light in the room, aside from the spotlight on the stage, were the flickering candles at each table. Then, someone came out on stage to announce the show for the night, a celebrity comedian. While we ate, the comedian performed his show and made Edric and I laugh together. It was so funny that I quickly forgot about how scared I was before, and soon I felt as though it was just Edric and I there, enjoying a show together while we had dinner. In fact, with the way that Edric sat right next to me with either his hand or his leg touching me at all times, I really did feel like a real couple on a night out. And at one point, I glanced over at him to see him laughing loudly at one of the comedian's jokes. He was even more handsome when he was happy. I loved the way his eyes squeezed shut and the way that he tilted his head back when he laughed, and it made me smile even more. During those moments, I thought that I could see him laugh like that forever, and I'd be happy. After the show, the lights came back on and people began to stand. "Is the event over already?" I asked. Edric shook his head. "Not for a while yet," he replied, sounding a little disappointed. "Now we'll have to mingle. It's important for appearances." I swallowed and nodded, feeling nervous as we stood, but Edric held his arm out for me. As I looped my hand through his arm and followed him around while he chatted with people, however, I could tell that their smiles were fake and that they kept giving me side glances. Especially the women. I felt instantly judged and out of place, and as the time went on, I felt more and more uncomfortable despite being right beside Edric. However, I quickly learned to put on a fake smile like the rest of them, and tuned out all of the boring conversations and instead busied myself with looking at all of the beautiful artwork and reliefs carved into the walls and ceiling. Even if events like this would always contain a lot of boring chatter between business people, I couldn't help but think that I was at least lucky to enjoy so much beautiful and historic artwork. But I also noticed that many of the other wives seemed to be mingling together and talking, and not a single one of them invited me to chat, which honestly hurt quite a bit. At one point, I needed to use the restroom. I excused myself while Edric was having a lengthy conversation with one of his business partners about market fluctuations or some other boring business topic, and made my way over to the restrooms. The restrooms were located down a small hallway, which offered a bit of reprieve from the noise of the event. I let out a small sigh as I walked up to the door and put my hand out to open it. But I stopped when I heard laughter and voices inside. "How ridiculous," I heard a woman say. "Who wears green eyeshadow to an event like this?" Another woman laughed loudly. Maybe she got too busy playing with her mommy's makeup before the event. Then a third woman, "No, darling. She's an orphan, don't you know?" The other women gasped in unison. Edric Morgan is planning on marrying not only a human, but an orphan too? I always thought that there was something wrong with him. Surely a man like that being single for this long has some sort of strange fetish or another. My eyes widened as I listened to their conversation. I could handle people talking poorly about me, as it was something that I had grown used to as a human in a world dominated by werewolves. But to say something so nasty about Edric made my blood boil. Maybe I should have just walked away, but I was too stubborn. I couldn't stop myself from pushing the door open. Moana. I knew that I should have just walked away, but I was too stubborn to just let these women get away with talking so poorly about Edric like that. When I pushed the door open, the women suddenly stopped talking. Their eyes were wide as they turned to face me. "What are you talking about?" I said as I stepped into the bathroom. The women were silent. I felt like I was being appraised and judged as they looked me up and down, but I didn't care. If people were going to say such nasty things about Edric, then they could judge me all they wanted. But I was going to say something about it, and I felt as though I caught them in the act. However, the women's shock quickly wore off. Their wide-eyed looks turned to plastic smiles. "It's not very polite to eavesdrop," one of the women, a blonde with an enormous diamond ring on her finger, said. She leaned into the mirror and wiped a bit of her lipstick away from the corner of her mouth with her pinky finger, eyeing me in the reflection as she did so. "I hope you don't eavesdrop often. It's not very becoming, especially not for someone of your status to be doing to a group of upper-class werewolves." I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing would come out, and the women quickly realized that their rudeness left me speechless, which meant that they had won. All I could do was stand there with narrowed eyes while all three of them brushed past me, one after the other. The last woman bumped me with her shoulder deliberately before she left. Once I was alone, I stood there feeling a combination of both sadness and anger. Sadness that my social status would never let me be worthy of respect, and angry that these seemed to be the types of women I had to look forward to in the future, now that I was involved with an alpha billionaire. If I went on to continue to be in a relationship with Edric, real or fake, I couldn't help but feel as though I would never be able to make any true friends again. If this was what wealthy women were like, then I didn't want any part of it, and I could only hope that I never turned out like them in the end. Finally, the event came to an end. On the way home, I kept trying to remind myself that I did have a nice time with Edric during the comedy show, and that was the most important thing. None of the other things, such as the paparazzi or the mean women in the restroom, mattered. But that was easier said than done, and I still felt sad. As we got ready for bed, I was too tired to even hide my sadness anymore. And Edric seemed to notice. "Are you all right?" he asked. He was sitting up in bed with a book in his lap while I busied myself with brushing out my hair in the bathroom mirror. I had just taken my makeup off, which always made me sad because of how beautiful Tyrus's work was. And I didn't care one bit if those horrible women thought that my green eyeshadow was ugly. I thought it was perfect. And from now on, I knew that I would always ask Tyrus to give me green and gold eyeshadow just to spite them. I nodded at first, but as I looked in the mirror, I could still see the deep frown at the corners of my lips and the sad look in my eyes. Edric noticed too and wouldn't let me get away with lying. "I can tell something's wrong," he said, shutting his book and setting it on the side table before folding his arms across his chest. "Just tell me, is it the paparazzi? I promise you'll get used to it, and they'll calm down eventually so it won't be so bad in the future." I shook my head and set my hairbrush down with a sigh. "It's not that," I replied. "I know it'll get easier. It's just—" My voice faltered. I hung my head, unsure as to how to broach the subject. I didn't know if I should have told Edric about what those women were saying or not. Maybe he would have just told me that it was nothing more than gossip, and he would have looked down on me for falling victim to it. "Go on," he urged. Another sigh escaped my lips. "After tonight, I'm just worried that I'm ruining your image," I finally admitted. "At the event, I knew that people were staring at me and talking about me, and I'm worried that it's going to reflect on you in a negative way. I don't want to hurt how other people see you. What if it makes you isolated?" Edric was silent for a long time. I was still facing the mirror, watching myself as I talked, but I finally worked up the nerve to turn to face him. I didn't realize it at first, but I now noticed that he had gotten out of bed and was now standing in the bathroom doorway. "Why do you think I would care what any of those people think?" he asked, his voice low and quiet as he fixed his gray eyes on me. I shrugged. "They're your colleagues, your peers. I assume some of them are even your friends." Edric scoffed. "Friends?" he said with a laugh. "None of those people are my friends. In fact, I can't stand a single one of them." My eyes widened. I was taken aback by what Edric said. At the event, he seemed to interact with all of them so naturally and charmingly. I watched him all night as he laughed along with his business partners and colleagues, how he charmed the women and bantered with the men. Their faces had all been stiff and plastic, but I assumed that it was just because of my presence. But Edric had seemed to be enjoying himself just fine, which made me surprised to hear that he couldn't even stand any of them. "Really?" I asked. "All night you seemed to get along with everyone." "Sure, I played nice," Edric replied with a shrug. "That's just what you do at these sorts of things. It doesn't mean I like any of them. The only thing I liked about the entire night was just having dinner and watching the comedy show with you. I could have been perfectly happy if that was all we did, but I had to pretend to like people for appearances." As Edric spoke, I felt my face get hot. His words made me blush. "I enjoyed dinner and the show with you too," I said quietly, staring down at my feet to hide my red face. "Good." Edric turned then and climbed back into bed. "All that matters to me is that you had a nice time, even for just a little while." Edric laid down then and shut off his bedside lamp. I stood in the doorway for a few moments, still in shock, before I finally crawled into bed myself. And as I fell asleep next to him, I couldn't help but smile as I thought about Edric's sweet words. Edric. I fell asleep beside Moana that night with a bit of a smile on my face. Even though the event started out on a bad note with the paparazzi, it was a lot of fun to enjoy the comedy show with Moana. Even just that short time of the event made the entire event worth it, despite the fact that I was forced to mingle with people who I utterly hated. To call myself one of those people always made me sick. I hated how they acted, I hated their views on the world, and I hated their horrible attitudes. I never felt as though those people could ever even come close to being my friends, which was why it was almost laughable when Moana told me that she was worried she would ruin my image. Those people were already looking for any little thing they could find to ruin anyone's image. If it wasn't Moana, it would have been something else. Even if they knew that Moana was not only a werewolf, but that she was my fated mate, and that there was something else that was exceedingly special about her, they still would have found something to nitpick. Moana always held herself with so much grace, and she was so beautiful, especially in the hair and makeup that Tyrus did for her, although she still would have been stunning in a paper bag. that the other women would have hated her anyway. But I didn't care. I was just happy to have spent the night with Moana. And ever since I found out that she was my mate, I couldn't get enough of her. When we went to bed that night, I couldn't deny the fact that I felt as though I'd made the right choice in announcing my relationship with Moana. And maybe, if she really was my mate, it wouldn't have to be fake forever. However, that night, I had strange dreams about Moana. I kept dreaming about that alpha tooth that Moana had shown me. In my dreams, it always seemed to be there, but something was special about it. It wasn't just any ordinary tooth. At one point, the dream started to get a little intense. I dreamed that Moana had some special powers that I couldn't quite explain, but there was something else. She was in danger. Someone was hunting her, but I didn't know why. All I knew was that I felt a sense of panic, and I needed to protect her. I awoke suddenly with a start, breathing heavily with my forehead coated in sweat from the intense dreams. When I looked over at Moana in the darkness, I was relieved to find that she was still sleeping soundly and peacefully. Her chest was rising and falling gently, and her red hair was splayed out around her on her pillow like an orange halo. Of course, she was safe. It was just a dream, after all. But I still couldn't quite shake that feeling of dread in my stomach, and I knew that even with Moana by my side, I wouldn't be able to sleep now. My eyes wandered then over to my top dresser drawer. Since Moana had been staying in my room most nights, I had given her that drawer to put some of her things in, and one of those things was the box that contained the tooth. I wasn't exactly sure why she kept it in here, instead of keeping it in her own room, but I got the sense that she felt uncomfortable being away from it for some reason. It was as if she needed to keep it close to feel at ease. Those strange dreams made me too curious. I needed to take a look at the tooth. I took one last glance over at Moana, who had now rolled onto her side, before I quietly got up and tiptoed across the room. When I silently opened the top drawer, there it was, the wooden box that held the tooth. I picked it up gingerly and opened it. As I gently picked the tooth up and held it up to the moonlight, my eyes widened at what I saw. I knew before that there was something odd about the tooth when Moana first showed it to me, but I hadn't looked at it in the moonlight that time. And tonight was a full moon. As I held it up to the light, it began to glow ever so slightly. It glowed a soft golden color. A slight gasp escaped my throat. I quickly put the tooth back in the box and stuck it back in the drawer, my eyes still wide in disbelief. I had only heard stories about a tooth like this, a golden tooth that could only be seen in the moonlight. But those were just fairy tales for little kids. Or were they? If I thought I wouldn't get any sleep before, I certainly wasn't going to get any sleep now. I needed to do some research of my own, because if Moana was truly in possession of a tooth like this, then that could only mean one thing. She was the golden wolf. All of the signs pointed to it. Her strange abilities, her overpowering scent, her wolf not emerging until she was much older. And now, the tooth. But I was still skeptical. I never even thought that the golden wolf was real. Everyone always thought that it was nothing but a legend. Maybe I was just seeing things, I thought to myself. Either way, I needed to do some research, and so I quickly put my robe on and quietly left the room to head to my office. Once I was in my office, the first thing I did was turn on my computer and begin to search for information on the golden wolf. Of course, there wasn't much available other than the legend of the golden wolf that every mother told her children. But there were some sources pointing to the existence of a very old book that contained information on the golden wolf. I found mention of the book on some obscure online mythology forums. People seemed to talk about it like it was some sort of holy grail of information. The legend was that it was written by the very man who claimed to have seen the golden wolf, right before he was executed. Some said that it was nothing but the ramblings of a mad man, but many other people insisted that this book held a lot of useful information. It was so rare that there were no copies available online. In fact, there weren't even any pictures available of it. Maybe it was a stretch. It was very possible that the book was also a myth in and of itself, and that it didn't actually exist. But it was my only link to learning more about the golden wolf, and I knew I had to try, because if Moana really was the golden wolf, then my dreams were right. If Moana really was the golden wolf, then she was in grave danger, and it was my job as her fated mate to protect her. Moana. A few days passed by after the networking event. Things felt peaceful in the penthouse, and although I really only stayed in with Ella to stay away from the paparazzi, I didn't mind. It was relaxing to stay inside and away from the public, and I spent a lot of time drawing and reading with Ella, which was nice after being so busy lately. I just hoped that events such as the networking event were few and far between. Although I enjoyed spending the evening with Edric and watching the comedy show together that night, I didn't like the other people that were there, and I feared that I would see many of the same people at future events like that. However, it seemed that my reprieve was brief, because Edric came to me a few days later and told me about another upcoming event that I would have to attend with him. "I need you to come to a work event with me tomorrow morning," Edric said casually as he stirred his tea on Thursday morning before work. I felt my shoulders sag as he told me this. I was still tired from the last event, and I didn't feel up to mingling with more celebrities and businessmen who looked down on me because of my social status. "Do I have to go?" I asked, a bit sheepishly. "I'm still tired after that first event." Edric sighed. "I know you are, but this event will be different, I promise." I raised an eyebrow. "How so?" The alpha billionaire shrugged and took a sip of his tea. When he set the teacup down, he picked up his newspaper and opened it with a flick of his wrists while he crossed his legs. I thought that I would never get used to how handsome he looked during mundane moments like this. Even when he was just casually drinking his breakfast tea and reading the paper, he looked incredibly attractive. "It's a picnic," he replied. "Just a little employee appreciation event. It'll be outside with games and food, and Ella can come too." The way that Edric described the event was tempting. It did sound nice to spend the day outside, and if Ella could have a chance to play in the park after being cooped up in the penthouse all week, then I would do it for her. "Will I need to have my hair and makeup professionally done again?" Edric chuckled and shook his head. "No, it's just casual. Wear something nice, of course, but remember that you'll be outside. Dress comfortably." I couldn't help but let out a small sigh of relief. Now that the pregnancy was progressing, high heels were becoming more and more uncomfortable. My feet were beginning to swell a bit, and I found myself feeling more tired in my knees, hips, and back than usual, so comfortable shoes were a necessity at this point. "Okay," I finally agreed. "I'll go." Edric seemed pleased and took another sip of his tea. However, I did secretly wonder if this would be my life from now on as the wife of a famous alpha CEO, event after event with little rest in between. And somehow, Edric must have seen the uncomfortable look on my face and glanced up at me over his newspaper with a furrowed brow. "Everything okay?" I nodded at first, but Edric kept staring at me, and finally I decided to tell him the truth about how I felt. "I just don't know how well I'll handle so many events from now on," I replied. "I'm still tired from the first one. Is this what it's like? One event after the other with hardly any rest in between?" Edric was silent for a few moments before he neatly folded his newspaper back up and set it down on the table. He leaned on his elbows then and looked at me with a sigh. "I promise this is the last one for a while," he replied. "The end of summer and the holidays are busy, but other than that, it's not typically like this. Besides, you get used to it quickly, and it doesn't feel so draining after your first few events, especially once the paparazzi gets bored of our relationship and moves on." Edric's words were comforting, but a bit depressing at the same time. I didn't want to admit it, but I really didn't enjoy these sorts of events. The thought that I would have to learn to simply get used to them was a little depressing, as it meant that there was no getting away from them, despite the fact that our public relationship was fake. Not only that, but to have our relationship, real or not, be treated as a fad that people would quickly get bored of made me feel sad. I wasn't a commodity to be sold to the public. I was a person. But despite all of this, Edric reached across the table then and squeezed my hand. I felt my heart skip as his hand touched mine, and when I met his gaze, his eyes were soft and understanding. Maybe things like this wouldn't be so bad after all when I had him here for support. Edric then pulled his hand away just as quickly as he extended it and stood, ending our brief moment of comfort together. I felt my face go red as he stood, and I quickly looked away and hid my hands beneath the table. "Remember," he said as he looked at his watch and picked up his suit jacket off of the back of the couch, slinging it over his forearm. "It's just a Labor Day picnic. It'll be fun." I nodded and watched as Edric walked out of the dining room. I heard the elevator doors open and close before I let out a small sigh and returned to eating my own breakfast. Maybe it would be fun. It would be fun for Ella too, especially if there were other children there. But even with all of this in mind, I still couldn't deny the fact that the first event left a bad taste in my mouth. It wasn't the event itself that was the problem. I actually had a nice time with Edric and would have gladly done it again. But rather the people. Because of my lower social status, people hated me, and I knew that some of those very same people would likely be at the picnic, where they would also likely ridicule me once again. I didn't want to put Ella through ridicule too, since they thought that she was my biological daughter. I could only imagine the sorts of nasty things that people like that would say about a half-blooded little girl. Besides, even if they did know that I was a werewolf, I would still be nothing but a freak for not having my wolf emerge until much later in life, not to mention my low status of growing up in an orphanage. No matter which way I turned, I knew that I would always face the ridicule of wealthy people like that. And I didn't want to put Ella or my baby through that same ridicule. My dear readers, thank you for stopping by and reading this story. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm trying my best to update Ask P. I'll appreciate it if you explore my other stories as well. Please follow my page Eve Above Story and group Eve's Alphas if you want to chat or keep updated on my writing schedule. Yours, Eve Above Story.